Hello, my name is Graham Clark. I'm a Canadian home inspector, professional engineer, and expert witness in the fields of construction and home inspection. Now, I practice in Ontario, and very often, whenever home inspectors in Ontario get together, one of the questions that comes up is, when is licensing going to take effect? Home inspection licensing, when is that coming? And it's a good question. And there was a lot of activity on it for quite some time, but nobody's really heard anything for a while. And I thought I'd give an update as to what is actually going on. And just leading up to that, let me run through really quickly what the history of this has been, because it is relevant. In October 2012, the Ministry of Government and Consumer Services, or whatever it is that they were called at the time, they changed their name pretty frequently, they announced that they were going to look into the regulation of home inspectors. They didn't really give any home inspectors much warning of that. The press conference where they announced it had a bunch of reporters, some educators. It was held at George Brown College, and Mike Holmes was there. Eventually, they did bring a bunch of home inspectors into the discussion. A week or two later, there was a much larger meeting, again with a whole bunch of home inspectors. And they told us that their plan was to put together an expert panel and gather inputs to determine whether or not legislation is called for. In August of 2013, that expert panel, that's what they called it, the expert panel was put together, and this included home inspectors from a bunch of different associations. It included realtors, it included educators, insurance people, included a lawyer. As a matter of fact, the lawyer who was on the panel is Doug Downey, who is now the Attorney General of Ontario. And over the course of a series of meetings through consensus, all of those stakeholders put together a number of recommendations which were eventually produced and given to the ministry in December of 2013. The report was called A Closer Look. And as I say, it contained a whole bunch of recommendations as to whether or not home inspections should be regulated. Generally, the answer was yes. And what things would have to be taken into account in doing so. For example, what standard of practice might be used, what qualifications might there be to allow somebody to get a home inspection license. So that was in 2013. There might have been another meeting or two of that group, really just to update the group on what was going on. But the next important thing was that in February of 2016, a private member's bill was introduced to license home inspectors or to regulate home inspectors. In March 2016 was the second reading of the bill, and then the bill was sent to committee. And committee is where the bill gets looked at and evaluated and questions get asked, and then it comes back to the legislature. Well, that never happens because that parliamentary session ended. And when a parliamentary session ends, all legislation on the table just dies. And this bill died right there. Shortly after the new session of the legislature began, the bill, Putting Consumers First bill, was introduced. And this was a consumer protection bill that proposed a couple of things, one of which was regulation of payday lenders, and another was the regulation of home inspectors. So it received its first reading in November 2016. Shortly after that was a second reading. It was sent to committee, and the committee, I can't remember the name of the committee, but they had a bunch of people come in, asked questions of a bunch of experts, and basically said, "Yep, let's move this bill forward." It went back to the Ontario legislature. It received its third reading, and then in April 2017, it received royal assent. So it became law. But it was not in force yet, because this law, this act, the Home Inspection Act 2017, which is what it's now called, the Home Inspection Act contains a large framework for the regulation or the licensing of home inspectors, and basically says things like, in order to do a home inspection in Ontario, you need to have a license. And to get a license, you have to meet whatever the requirements are of the regulations. And you have to carry whatever insurances are required by the regulations. And you have to do this, that, and the other thing as required by the regulations. So the regulations is where all the detail is. Like really what it looks like, that's in the regulations. But the regulations weren't written, just this overarching act. So that was in April 2017. In early 2018, probably around April, I can't remember exactly, the ministry announced that the CMRAO, the Condominium Managers Regulatory Authority of Ontario, had agreed, at least in principle, to administer the Home Inspection Act, basically to be the administrative authority, the licensing body for the Home Inspection Act. I'm not sure whether it was actually ever formalized, but it was announced that the CMRAO is who was going to be doing that. Now, the CMRAO was also a really new regulatory authority to license condominium or regulate condominium managers. And they had their plate full getting themselves set up and didn't start doing any work on home inspection because, again, the regulations had not been drafted. Well, shortly after that, June 2018, election in Ontario. All of the work done so far had been done under the Liberal government. June 2018, Liberal government loses, Conservative government comes into power. And you have to wonder, is the Consumer government introduced in pushing forward laws that were created by the former Liberal government? Maybe, maybe not so much. Well, in November 2018, the ministry brought together a bunch of representatives from the home inspection community, including people who were on that expert panel, and asked a bunch of pointed questions about how regulations might affect home inspectors. Questions like, well, what type of insurance do home inspectors typically carry? How many home inspectors do you think there are? How many home inspectors do you think actually carry insurance? How many inspectors do you think are full-time? How much do you think a home inspector might be able to pay for a home inspection license? How much do you think a home inspector might be able to pay for education? How much do you think it might cost to get into the business? A lot of questions, especially around the cost of things. Now, my impression of this meeting was that the ministry people were really trying to gather information that would demonstrate a financial hardship to home inspectors if they ever actually had to introduce licensing. For example, they were saying, well, if a home inspector had to pay $5,000 to $8,000 to get an education and then had to pay $5,000 a year for insurance and $1,000 a year for continuing education and $1,500 a year for their home inspection license, would people even get into that business? Could we be damaging the home inspection business? And since home inspection is inherently a consumer protection service, having very few home inspectors in Ontario would actually be bad for the end consumer. They seem to be looking for reasons to not implement the Home Inspection Act. At the end of the meeting, the ministry people were asked by the home inspectors and all the others in the room, what's next? The answer was, we'll tell you when we have something to tell you. Well, the answer is, well, what will you be telling us that? The answer was, when we have something to tell you, we will tell you. That's when. That was November 2018, and they haven't told us anything since. It's now February 2021. The end of February 2021, for what it's worth. So nothing has happened in that last 2.5 years. And I recently made some inquiries with my MPP and the ministry, somebody pretty high up in the ministry, like really high up, somebody who would know. And although it's not an official position, so I can't, unfortunately, name names, you can take it from me that this is pretty reliable information. The questions I asked were, have there been any regulations drafted to bring the Home Inspection Act into force? And is there any work at all being done on regulating home inspectors in Ontario? And the answer was no. Right now, no work is being done to move this bill forward. No work has been done to move this bill forward in the last couple of years, or to move this act forward, technically. No regulations are being drafted, and there is no indication that in the short term, anyway, that the Home Inspection Act is going to be brought into force. Therefore, in the short term, there's not going to be any home inspection licensing in Ontario. Whether you think that's good news or bad news, that's just what the news is. No news means nothing is happening. Now, one important aspect of all of this is this bill received royal assent in 2017, and right now it's just sitting there waiting for regulations and waiting to be brought into force. Well, there's a 10-year limit on legislation that receives royal assent. If it doesn't become law, if it isn't in force within 10 years after it receives royal assent, it just dies. And we are pretty much 4 years into that 10-year time frame right now. And that just really seems like it was a blink of an eye, frankly, to me. It doesn't seem like it was that long ago. 6 years from now, in 2027, the bill is just going to die unless it's actually turned into law. Regulations are drafted, and this government certainly seems to have no interest in doing that. And we will have at least one election before then. But if you consider that if the Conservative government wins another majority, or even just wins back the government, chances are that this current Ford government is going to still be in place in 2027. And I wouldn't expect any action on this file. If there hasn't been any action in the last 4 years, it's very unlikely there's going to be any action in the next 6 years. And so it just dies. So the short version of all of this, the too long didn't read version of this, is a lot of work went into developing recommendations, although frankly, governments keep saying, well, we consulted with industry. I constantly kept hearing politicians say, well, we consulted with industry. We consulted with home inspectors. Yes, they consulted, but the fact is, a lot of the stuff that I actually see in that recommendation paper didn't actually make it into either of the acts that were eventually put forward to government. So yeah, when a government says they consulted, it doesn't mean that they actually heeded any of those consultations or heeded any of the recommendations. But yeah, they consulted. So it's unlikely we're going to see home inspection licensing in Ontario, honestly likely at any point in the next 10 years, because even if a future government introduces a new act, it's also going to take some time to go through the legislative process and to have regulations drafted. So in the short term, no home inspection license in Ontario. That's just the way it is. So whether that's good news or bad news for you, that's the news. Hope it helped. Stay tuned to the channel. We'll have more videos on more home inspection cases coming up. Hope you enjoyed this. Thanks very much.